Number 10, which is the second consolidation in 1906, which was called the Independent Breweries Company. And it was all these independent little breweries that had built up through the 1890s, and they then combined to form IBC. And what's left with us today is IBC root beer. It's still found today, and it was their formula and their brand from Prohibition era. The Brewers of St. Louis got together. Adolphus Busch apparently put up the majority of money, but he put up $1 million in 1904 dollars. He created a venue called the German Tyrolean Alps. And they hired landscape architects to come over from Germany and built on 7 acres of ground, not within 200 yards of where these tents are, right up the street there, called the Tyrolean Alps. And it was the largest entertainment and dining venue at the fair. They could feed 8,000 people. They had an indoor dining hall, they had outdoor dining areas, they had musicians and bands that came over from Germany and played all the Papa, and they sold all the different brands of beer. You look at their menu, and you got Budweiser and Alpenbrau and Falstaff and brands like that were all for sale at the German Tyrolean Alps. The next great date, number 8, is October 19th, 1809. And on October 18th, 1809, I'm sorry, there was an ad in the St. Louis paper called the Missouri Gazette. And this paper was the first paper printed in St. Louis, and it didn't start printing until like March of 1809. And in October, there was an ad by a man by the name of John Coons. John Coons advertised that he was wanting to purchase hops and barley at his brewery. Now this brewery, it's documented that John Coons was here and where he was, and he lived down very close to the Arch Grounds. The whole city was pretty much where the Arch Grounds are today. And he was here and he was brewing beer, and it's the first documented evidence of brewing in St. Louis. It was 1809. So, number 7 is around 1840, and this date is in serious dispute amongst the historians here in St. Louis. It's got anything to do with the brewing industry. Adam Lemp brought lager beer to St. Louis. It is a documented fact that he was indeed the original first brewer of lager beer in St. Louis. In 1953, when Anheuser-Busch purchased the St. Louis Cardinals. And that was Gussie Busch's reign, and he pretty much drove this, he was running his clubhouse down there on Pestalozzi Street, and they pretty much did what Gussie wanted to do. So they bought the Cardinals and became the owner. They owned it up until just recently when they sold it for $250 million or whatever they sold it for. It's a ridiculous number. Number 5 most important date was in 1920. Papa Joe Griezidick, who at the time owned Griezidick Beverage Company out here west of the city in Forest Park Boulevard, went to William Lemp Jr. and laughably offered to buy the Falstaff Shield logo and the Falstaff brand name. And after some discussion, William Lemp did in fact sell it to him. For 25 years after there, William Lemp committed suicide in the Lemp Mansion. I think Bob's going to go there tomorrow. But there was 4 members of that family that committed suicide, 3 of them in the mansion. Number 4, a guy named George Snyder built what was called the Bavarian Brewery down on South Broadway in Dorcas. In the book 100 Years of Brewing, if any of you are familiar with that book, was a landmark book done in 1903 published by H.S. Rich out of Chicago. And in that book he described George Snyder's brewery as a primitive affair, a hole in the ground with a wood shanty being the brew house. And today that is Anheuser-Busch is how they started, as a hole in the ground with a wood shanty. And today they're an $18 million a year company, but in 1852. So 1933 was not only a big event in the entire United States, it was a big event in St. Louis. Falstaff and Anheuser-Busch both had beer ready on April 7th. Both rolled out beer here in St. Louis on that day. They had already been making near beer and everything else, so it was just a matter of leaving the alcohol in and changing the labels and going through the permits and put your beer on the market. By the end of 33 here in St. Louis, there was 6 other breweries that had been in operation. So there was 8 of them operating by the end of 1933. Unfortunately, 34, 35, 36 Most of those started closing for a lot of reasons. The number 2 event and important date is September 17th, 1854. And this is hard to realize in today's beer environment, but it's the year that St. Louis ran out of beer. And the newspapers carried these articles that there was no more beer, and there wouldn't be any more beer available, local beer, until October. But at that time, they were brewing beer during the wintertime, and you stored it, and then you consumed it, and hopefully you got through to the next year's batch, and they didn't. They come up short. And the reasons were that it had been a hot summer, that the previous year's barley crop had been poor. This all sounds kind of familiar to most of you, okay? To all of you, and some things never changed. But the other problem they had was all the Germans that had moved to St. Louis, and they weren't real happy with this change of environment. They brought a lot of beer, was the good news, but the bad news was now they were in here drinking all. The number 1 important date is was last year. Was May of last year. A lot of you were here for the event, and it was the St. Louis Brewers Heritage Festival. And I think it marked a great turning point in involvement, relationships of the brewers in St. Louis. Next week they'll all go out and they'll be fighting each other over tap handles and shelf space and everything else. And but that's left for another day. But this event is really about beer and the celebration of beer. And as the guy on the Red Stripe commercial says, beer, hooray, beer. And that's what it's about. And that's, I think, is the whole coming together of the industry, and also a change in just the mentality of how these people look at each other and communicate with each other. And I think it's probably the greatest thing that ever happened in the brewing industry in St. Louis.